it's showtime. So, we'll close this just in case there's somebody coming in for
It just feels better.
Yeah, it's some people come in for massage or something with Jordan or walk through. And I know that Saturday's class, they could hear us. in Yasa, so, okay.
Better?
Yeah, that looks great.
Not tight.
So when we talk about yin, and I am going to read a little bit out of some of these texts, but at the same time, one of the things that I recognized about yin when I first started yoga in the first place is that I hated it. I hated it. I had absolutely no patience for that nonsense. I am not laying here for 5 minutes in this excruciating posture and then having to do it on the other side. And we're going to do how many postures? 10, 9, maybe? But all of a sudden, the second time that I went, it gave. All the things that we expect to happen again actually happened. You know, I opened up my hips, right? Shoulders began to loosen up. The trapezoids down the side of my neck, which were always chronically tight because I have a fused disc back here. I've had some work done. And so all of a sudden, this magical sort of yoga, whereas yang yoga or yang yoga, depending on how you pronounce it, is the movement of breath and flow of muscular tension. When I started to come into yin, I realized all the places that I was tight, but also all the places that I wasn't tight. I started to give myself a little credit for being able to open up. And as I felt that, it allowed me to flow that feeling through everything else. And I still have places that are tight, and we all do. But in the same sense, yin became almost like my Tao, almost like my methodology of doing yoga. I would do yin in order to prepare for yang, as opposed to the other way around. I'd open it up, get it cracked open, and then head in there, and I'd be ready, right? And so
Yes, but you don't want to go the other way.
Which is what I do all the time. So interesting. Because a lot of times the yin is from like 7 to 8,
Yeah.
so I'll do like the, yeah.
Yeah,
I hadn't
you
thought
can-
about doing it that way.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right. So you want your muscles to be cool
Right.
when you do yin.
right.
Right.
So if you go do yin, yang, first, and you come in here and stretch, it's not as beneficial to you. It's better to do the yang after.
Right. Okay.
That's why the room
I
is
never
cool.
thought about that.
Yeah, the room is cool so you don't heat up. I mean, we've stretched enough today that our muscles are probably still pretty stretched out.
Well, also it's been a long time. So
Yeah.
if we do yin now, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. So that's one of the things that I came to recognize is that there's environments for both.
Yeah.
And if you do it, the order that you do it is really helpful. The beautiful part about this is that yin also helps a lot of people that are in that accessible place, right, that need to have that extra assistance. I have a couple of clients that are older, and I have one gentleman who's 70 years old, and I'm going to totally some of you of this, but in the sense that he came into the studio wanting to stretch and get longer because he is a champion cyclist at 70 years old. He's number 1, number 2 usually in the age group in the country.
Wow.
And he's a great guy. He's a type A, but he's a really nice fellow. And when he came in here, he really was very, very stiff. And I said, the first thing we're going to do is yin. And we did about a month's worth. He came once a week for about a month, and it was remarkable what was happening to him. And the reason why he confessed to me at a certain point that he was doing this because he came in second place last year and pissed him off. It made him mad. He said, I saw that guy's back wheel right in front of me, and I just couldn't get up into my seat and do those last few bumps and take it over. And so over time, we've been doing yin, and the thing that really is remarkable, because we do it in here, is that you watch someone begin to open up and begin to have that length and that strength in their connective tissues. And when you're 70, I imagine your connective tissues are a little different than when you're 30, right? And so he really,
Well, you and I are not that far from.
it's really the truth, right? He calls me kid all the time. I laugh. And so I watched that process, and I saw essentially an anatomical model of somebody going from not doing yin at all to being able to be flexible. And in that same way, and this is very similar to the story I told you about the guy touching his toes, he had a really hard time with child's pose. He just couldn't get down. He just could not get those hips down. He'd sit on a block and go, that hurts. And put him on 2 blocks. He says, okay, I'll barely do this.
Where did it hurt him? In his knees or
They did in his lower back.
in his lower back?
In his lower back. He just could not tuck in enough to get his knees spread out and his butt on his heels, basically. And so in that process, we went through a lot of other postures as well. We used the straps, we used the blocks, got him lengthened out. And the last time I saw him before he went on the race in California, he said, I want you to see something. And he flipped over and he came into child's pose. And he said, while he's in child's pose, he goes, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out. I can totally do this. I'm freaking out. And then he flipped over again and he said, and watch this. And he's laying on his back, grabs his knee, going straight to his nose. And he's like, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out. Because all of a sudden, and he realized it really didn't have much to do with stretching his muscles, because they were fairly strong. It was all the connective tissue. He was bunching up. As a cyclist, he sits like this.
Yeah, that's a terrible,
Fifty-
for miles and miles and miles.
50, 60 miles.
Yeah.
So he just got back from California and he won the race. He totally won the race. He said, I left him in the dust because nobody else is doing anything. Now the other riders are doing any other training. He's doing all this yin and yang yoga and all. So again, it doesn't matter how old you are. You know, if you allow yourself to open up to the possibilities that it's not always about stretching the muscles, that there are other things that we can loosen up, that we can allow space for, that really do affect your performance, whether it's just household chores or whether you're riding down in Los Angeles on the Olympic course and beating all these 60-year-olds.
And when you're talking about yin, I don't really like the word stretch because that's a real American idea.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I like lengthening and strengthening. You do feel a stretch, right? But I think people have a wrong idea about that, what that is in their head.
Yeah.
I mean, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's several yin postures you can come into and say, I'm stretching, and you are in some ways, but what you're really doing is you're stressing, right? So when you're stressing, and you bring that energy into that particular joint package, right, where you have your ligaments, your tendons, your muscles, and your fascia,
Your bony landmark.
and your bone landmark, right?
You said what, lengthening and
Strengthening.
strengthening. I like that.
Yeah, people, when I tell my family, like, oh yeah, we're going to begin. I actually brought my mom and my sister here one night.
Yeah, that's
Never
great.
done it. And, you know, when you're trying to tell them about it though, of course we use the word stretching, but I also tried to say, oh, we're going to do different poses and
Or shapes.
yeah,
I like that word.
and take to hold those shapes for an extended amount of time while you just relax and then sort of meditate. But it's hard to not use that word stretch.
Yeah.
To somebody.
Well, and then that's the thing that they would understand first.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, when we say we're opening up your connective tissues, they're like, A, what's that? And B, that sounds sick. You know, so,
But lengthening and strengthening, who doesn't want that?
no,
Right.
That's a
that-
good advertisement.
I use that all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read to you because I like that. But the thing I'm going to read to you before we get into some of the manual. This is the recent history of yin yoga. And yin yoga is not new because even ISK Iyengar has some postures that he suggests you hold for 5-6 minutes. If you've ever seen Supta Vibrasana or fixed firm, you lay back under back and you have your knees tucked underneath you and you're sitting on your heels. He says, hold that for 5 minutes. I can't even do it.
That's Bernie Clark's favorite pose.
Is it? And so, in that way, you can imagine the intense pressure that's going on in there, that stress. But when you come out of it and they're released, I'll tell you. So, what is Yin Yoga? And how does it get its name? And then this particular book, Yin Yoga, Principles of Practice, this is by Paul Grilly. Paul Grilly, Sarah Powers, Bernie Clark. Those are the names that you think of Yin. The legacy and the lineage of Yin is not that long because a lot of the things that we now incorporate into Yin are Yang postures when we do them slowly or when we do them quickly in Vinyasa or Hatha. But when you take them into Yin and you slow it down, all of a sudden the mechanics change.
We're going to do that in our practice today with what we think of as lizard, and the Canadians call it dragon, and you're going to be really sick of it by the 15 minutes on one side and 15 minutes.
Are we doing that today?
Yeah, but don't worry, there's some.
So when we talk about the history of Yin, and this is just in the early days, this is something that happened in Southern California. Yin was associated with martial arts in a similar way that Qigong. When you notice some of the things that you did in our Qigong practice, it was very martial arty, right? It was like,
Well, especially the Ha-Ho.
yeah,
And
definitely.
I was watching a Paul Grilly last night, and he was talking about his mentor, Polly Zink,
All these things right here.
right? And so he was a martial artist that did Yin with his martial artist. Yeah.
Right, so imagine that. And so, Polly Zink is a martial arts expert and teacher of Taoist yoga. And that's with a T, or a D, if you want to spell it that way. And that's what they named that particular form of yoga, of taking the martial arts aspect and the Yin aspect, and they termed it as Taoist yoga. That name was given to that by Sarah Powers. And so I first saw Polly being interviewed on a public access talk show. Remember those? Pretty hilarious. Production values were uproariously funny. And he was dedicating that to martial arts. And at first I was impressed by his gentle and restrained answers, but he seemed to have none of the arrogant swagger or challenging state of mind as other martial arts. So what does that tell you about the Yin aspect and how it brings you back?
Humbles you down.
Yeah, it brings you back down. I mean, he's answering questions very humbly. You know, he's a martial artist, probably kick your ass to pieces, but that's not how martial arts works. And he contacted him, and he went to his weekly class on Taoist yoga. He practiced poses for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, chatting contentedly as Lee led the class. After nearly 2 hours of floor poses, we would stand and do some moving yang forms that imitated the movements of animals. All very interesting and all very different from the Hatha yoga that Paul was teaching. And so he stopped training with him, but he kept being really interested in it. And when he started to teach long floor postures, the studios wanted to know what to name the style in their advertising. And so, out of respect for Polly Zink, I suggested Taoist yoga, and Sue Fitzgerald agreed, and that was where the name came from. Now, as Yin Yoga, Sarah Powers is one of these people that is very, very, how to say, meditative. And she really thought that that whole aspect of Taoist yoga needed to be expounded upon. So after a workshop, Sarah resumed her busy travel teaching schedule, and she started introducing long, slow poses into her class, explaining that the flowing standing poses were the yang of the practice, and the long floor poses were the yin. When students asked where they could get more information about the yin practice, she graciously referred them to both. So this is how you start things, right? You might team teach with somebody else, and then all of a sudden you realize this is a great relationship. We can start to work on other things. This is how you make workshops with each other. Right? this is not just teaching the class all the time. If you have an interest in something and you want to share that with the studio and make a couple bucks too, but in the same sense, that's where you start to connect with your colleagues, your fellow yogis, on like-minded subjects. And these workshops are pretty well attended. If you've ever been to one of Marianne's women's workshops or women's circles, they're pretty well attended and they're very vibrant, very enthusiastic.
Yeah, and once you guys are certified, all you need to do if you have an idea is approach Marianne. She's really, really accessible about that sort of thing.
And so yin yoga is known as the quiet practice. Now, as far as the history, this stuff started in the 70s, just like a lot of things. People woke up from the 50s and 60s and said, yeah, maybe we just chill out a little bit. But in that way, studios started to accept it. Now, there are some studios that don't have yin. They're very much into that whole physical aspect. Like they'll have sculpt, they'll have hatha, they'll have vinyasa, they'll have all kinds of yang, but they won't have any yin. And people notice that and they miss out on it. And they will eventually suggest, can we have a yin class too? Now, when we talk about yin, we come onto that page 88. One of the best things that Bernie Clark ever said was, we don't use the body to get into the pose, we use the pose to get into the body. And that in itself is really the essence of yin, because you're taking your time to get into the pose. You are taking your body and you're letting that pose come to you, as opposed to the other way around. You don't have to chase it down. It's going to come into you.
It's the soma idea that Marianne teaches with the bring the image to your brain instead of searching for the image.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with the allow the pose to come into your body. Yeah.
And in the early parts of the 14th to 15th century, there's a document came out describing hatha, and the hatha yoga Pratipadika, which we'll go through in some more history later on, spends a lot of time talking about the practice of pranayama and meditation as opposed to asana. Right? So most of the time in the early days when it was just yin, people would come into a posture to meditate. They weren't necessarily trying to do anything physical, but they realized after a few minutes that something physical was happening as well as what was going on in between their ears. And a lot of that was because you only find a few things like that described until much later. The style was known as Taoist Yin or Taoist Yoga, because it combines theories of Chinese medicine, the meridians in your body, along with the practice of yoga. So what happens in yin is what we're doing not only just to the connective tissues, is that we're also aligning our meridians. And meridians are where the energy in your body flows. And they're not random, they're not all over the place. It looks like a grid. You see some of the imagery of meridians. And those meridians go through, and those meridians actually mirror, and we talked about this too, the acupuncture points. And acupuncture is, of course, Chinese medicine. And so there is a rationale to this. Now, again, when you think about energy, that intangible that you can't see, except that you can see it in your body when you're moving it, that's where some of the confusion comes in. What happens with the meridians and that energy flows through you, the fascia literally, because it's wrapping you up, sometimes will press to the point where that meridian will be cut off, and that energy won't flow anymore. Where that energy is flowing is to a place called the Sushumna. And the Sushumna is what we call the spiritual spinal cord that holds your chakras together, right? And it runs up and down, and those meridians feed into that Sushumna, and then that Sushumna feeds into your chakras. So imagine one of your meridians that's heading into your heart chakra is cut off. Emotionally, what do you think would happen to you?
It would just maybe feel
Close-hearted.
Yeah, careless.
No
Yeah.
empathy, no compassion.
Yep, you get a little cold. happens when you deprive a child of something? Sometimes
Yeah.
Or is
They
it
don't.
temper tantrum?
they have a temper tantrum.
They're dysregulated.
Yeah, so all of a sudden your heart chakra is dysregulated. So it may not be cold at all. It may be crazy, right? You may love everything, right? You may be obsessed with everything that you see. You may fall in love easily, well, quote unquote, fall in love. You may become infatuated with something very quickly because you don't have any control. It's cut off, it's deficient, it's dysregulated, as you say. And so when we practice yin, part of the process, besides the physical opening, is also using the meditative process to open up those meridians, to let things go. Yeah, you're letting the fascia release, come open, lengthen and strengthen. And remember, it's shrink wrapped. It's oftentimes not very flat. It's lumpy and bumpy. So it takes a little time. What is it? The statistic takes 6 months to change the shape of your fascia.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah, it takes a long time and a lot of practice.
I always, the thing is, whatever injury you have, whatever discomfort you have, however long it took you to get to that discomfort is probably going to take you that long to get out of that discomfort.
Yeah,
Like no less time.
right.
Don't think that, you know, if it took you 6 weeks to get hurt worse, that it's going to take you 2 days to get better. It's not.
That doesn't happen. It doesn't work. Rehab is always as long as it took you to get there. It's kind of the way it is. And again, V.S.K. Iyengar was one of the practitioners of holding postures longer. Now, they're not always the yin shapes that we know, but when he started doing that, it really did shift the energy of a lot of practice away from the physicality, so on and so forth. Remember, hot yoga was not around until later on in the 70s and 80s. It was just yoga. And so,
Unless you lived in India where it's
Yeah.
104 degrees anyway.
and that's the point. That's where it came from in that sense too. But you know, and I know, when you do yoga in a cold room, there's a chance that you might yank something, you might pull something, because you're cold. And so being able to come into those postures slowly and taking your time reduces that risk. Even though you're doing a yang posture, it reduces the risk.
And doing it mindfully.
Yes, always that. And that's really another focus behind yin too. And I'm not saying that yang is mindless, because there's a lot of meditative movements that we do. And it's meditation in motion, really. But in that way of being able to take your time, your space, give yourself grace, allow for those, bony landmarks, allow for those hard stops, and at the same time, reach deep inside, in between the ears and in between here. And so it became much more popular as time went on. Now, when we talk about the philosophy of yin and yang, and this is in your book as well, balancing is not static. Think of weighing scales, 2 plates held by a common string, suspended at a point halfway between them. When 2 equally weighted objects are placed up on the scale, there's a slight swaying motion. Okay? Notice that? And it goes up and down. It's balanced, but it's swaying. And so as you think about that, the middle point, or the middle path, but the middle point, that's the Chinese call it that Tao. And so when you're doing Taoist yoga, you're trying to come into that middle point where you can feel the sensations that we talked about. And at the same time, feel the lengthening and strengthening. The center is always there even if we are not there to enjoy it. And that's a really key statement. If you're not present, then yin is going to drive you nuts because you're laying there, right? But if you're present, if you're feeling it, it will actually give you space. When we leave the center, we take an aspect of yin or yang. Now, again, this is Taoist. So yin and yang, when we talk about that, that's Chinese. And so this is where you start to see the cultural melding of all of this, where, yes, this works for us, this works for us, maybe this works for all of us. And Bernie
never static. What is yin and what is yang is always in flux. And that is true.
Right, that was my next, I was gonna say, so like, there's gradations of everything. So you might say, yin is feminine, yin is dark, you know, whatever, yin is cold, yang is masculine, yang is hot, yang is light. But, is it in there? Yeah.
Yes.
So, but in between, so there's feminine yin, there's masculine yang, and there's whatever in between that. Gradations of masculine and feminine, because we all have masculine and feminine inside of us.
Absolutely.
And it's the same with yin and yang, right?
Right.
With everything, with the light and the dark, and the cold and the hot, there's lukewarm, there's dimly lit. So it's not, and like with muscles and tendons, muscles become tendons, tendons become bones. They're not separate, they're gradations. And then it goes the same.
I always think of yin and yang as pentagram and shading.
The grades.
Yeah, the grades. You don't just, and that's it. You're shading, where's the light being cast, where's the shadow and all that. That's what makes yin mysterious too.
Yeah.
Because there is that depth of thought where you start to think about things. And that's that meditative state when you're in a yin posture as well. And it really does give you that opportunity to see the differences, but to see the similarities as well. Yeah, on the second page, you'll see the yang is explained as the opposite condition. Things are less dense, lighter, higher, warmer, more obvious, superficial. And so the theory is that yin contains yang, yin becomes yang, yin controls yang. And when you think about that kind of thing, what we'll do is come into a couple of group things here. Now, think of the symbol for yin and yang, the white dot within the dark. Even within the darkness of yin, there's found a lightness of yang, and vice versa. And so you see the second list that's on this page number 91. As we see the elements within yang, we also observe how yin becomes yang, and how we can transform, and how yang can transform into yin. So for example, dragon, lizard, right? We do that in vinyasa all the time. We do it in yin dasa. We do it in slow flow. And it's considered a yang posture until you do it for 5 minutes. And then it's not.
And then it's real bitch.
We let that happen. Okay, so groupthink number 1. Where do we notice yin in our life? Where do we notice yang in our life? Where can we slow down and find stillness? Where might we add more activity or activation? Where do you see both? If anyone wants to pipe in?
I mean, I could talk about this for days and hours and weeks. It's like one of my favorite subjects. Because we always talk about like the masculine and the feminine, and these days it can get taken so many different directions, but really when it comes down to like the nitty gritty of it, it's this practical and mystical, this spiritual depth and practical strength. It's the shadows that drive the face we put forward, or the face that we put forward that, you know, can mold from our shadows or whatever. They're just so like intertwined. They cannot exist without one another, and they both are so incredibly important. But I think as safety, sometimes we tend to cling to one of them heavier than the other, because it's comfortable to maybe run hot and move and go and be strong, and it's a little bit more uncomfortable to release and let go and go within and calm. And, you know, so I think sometimes we find ourselves moving heavier in one area or the other, and where we find balance is in the uncomfortability of bringing in and going into that space of, I mean, for me, I love to run hot and go and survive and move and do and achieve and all of that, and that physical strength protects
that spiritual gentleness inside of us, right? That spiritual gentleness inside of us drives that physical strength. I don't know. There's a million ways to describe it, but
Absolutely.
I think the goal is what my balance is different than what your balance is, and what you pull in to soften one side or strengthen the other is going to be different than somebody else's.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. Anybody else got something they want to pop up with?
I think that yin makes people, they have to sit with themselves when they're not going and doing, and they're sitting in a yin posture to that, or some people, maybe like you, it was really hard for you at first, we were talking about that, because your mind is going, so, calm your mind, but all of a sudden you have to feel, not just physically, but like things start coming up, and people are like, no, get fidgety, or their muscles start